We're now sort of moving to the close of today's conference and to the ending, which is in a keynote by Stephen Wright. It's mysteriously entitled "Exit Strategies," which almost sounds like we need an exit strategy for this disparate, polymorphous questioning that we've been in today. Stephen Wright is a theorist, writer, curator, and independent researcher invested in theoretical alternatives to the current capitalist framework of the contemporary art world. Wright's projects investigate the use value of art in society, focusing on collective work that exists beyond objects, authorship, and spectatorship. He is on the editorial advisory committee of the journal Third Text and has held positions as program director of the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, and is corresponding editor of Parachute magazine. Wright lives in and works in Paris, and I would like to hereby give him the podium.
David, thank you very much for this introduction. Thanks, everyone said it, and it's not merely protocol, it's very sincere. Thank you to VHV for proposing my presence here today, and to Maria and all the team at BAC that did such a wonderful job in making this very seamless and easy. I'm supposed to deliver a keynote, but the keynote is typically the note which is given to set things off on the right footing. And I think the keynote in that respect was given by Maria in her prefatory remarks this morning, so long ago, in a formula which I found extremely intriguing, which I noted down, and which I take in a sense to be the kind of the keynote to the very diverse discussions which we've been having, when she described the rhetorical tool of former West as being a dehegemonizing tool. And later went on to clarify what she meant, what kind of a speculative device a turn of phrase of that kind could be. A concept that can actually give some kind of concrete form to intuitions which we feel, but which remain impacted and invisible in conceptual edifices, as it were. So in a sense, I would like to take her keynote as my own and to suggest a certain number of my own dehegemonizing devices, conceptual tools, which perhaps the most problematic of which, but I think also the most strenuous and I hope the most corrosive of which is that of a deontologizing tool. Because if I had to sum up the art historical moment in which we're living, in which we're struggling, and bring together these extremely diverse energies, intuitions, and practices both within and without the dominant art world, which are actually, despite their diversity and heterogeneity, not so different as that, because after all, we are subsumed by a historical moment. I would say that art is in the throes of a deontologizing moment. In other words, art is attempting to sunder itself from itself. Art, there is a kind of moment of historical sundering, of wresting art from its own ontology, or from that ontological edifice, which through a certain kind of ontological chauvinism, we continue to refer to as art. I will continually come back to this refrain. It will be sort of this deontologizing proposition will be kind of the refrain for the different constellations of concepts which I'll put forward in the next, not too long a while, the next half hour or so. What do I mean by, briefly, what do I mean by deontologizing? I mean that modernist practice, modernist art, was anything but ashamed of its ontology as art. In fact, its efficacy in the symbolic realm was premised on the fact that it was art. But in various ways, through the critique, the turn away, I suppose, from a certain representational paradigm or a regime of representation, and a shift, to some extent anyway, a performative turn or a shift towards more performative notion of art in recent times has, in a way, created a paradoxical situation which obliges us to rethink the very ontology of art. By ontology, I mean the being of art in the world. Not so much the mere appearance of art, but the specific visibility of art as opposed to everything else. I think one of the major assumptions which continues to be made, even in very learned parlance, about art is that whatever we may invest that three-letter word with, and however overburdened semantically it is, we somehow tend to assume that it refers to a subset of actions and symbolic configurations, a subset which is part of a broader set of actions and configurations, deeds and contrivances, which are not art. Art is therefore a subset, a minority activity, as opposed to the very many things in this world which are not art. That, in the second part of my talk, is specifically, that assumption is specifically what I want to challenge, and if there will be any exit strategies at all evoked, it will be precisely from this ontological assignment of certain actions, a specific set of them, actions and configurations as art. And to do that, I will make three references, art historical references to Marcel Duchamp. And in fact, it's with Marcel Duchamp that I will begin the first part, which of course deals not with the beyond, but which deals with the verb to be in the past tense, the was. Beyond, as you see written right here, beyond what was contemporary art continued. I'd like to just very briefly analyze that very simple proposition. Well, I say simple because it's deliberately stilted, of course. There's many things that could be said about it. I'm going to look at the beyond and at the past tense, the ontological dimension, the idea that contemporary art was something. In other words, that it did have a stable ontology. But there's something else, and perhaps it's a way of immediately addressing a kind of bringing this talk into a conversation with what Rasha Salti was saying earlier. Rasha will appreciate, if she's still here, the strange nature of this speech act. You'll notice that the first three words are Germanic, and that the following three are Latin. The English language, one of its salient characteristics is that it's a bastardized language. Upon a Germanic grammar, a Latin vocabulary was embedded. 80% of the words in any dictionary will come from Latin via French because of a 4-century-long occupation, introduced through the church and through the aristocratic class. But that was based upon a fundamental Germanic syntax, which remains in place, and which accounts only for 20% of the vocabulary, but that 20% is what we use 80% of the time. That gives English a certain form of resilience. And that sort of thing actually, the fact that there are always two words for everything, gives some cause for reflection. But it's not here that I want to engage in that reflection. But what I do want to say is that in a speech act of that kind, and perhaps this is a way to describe how art could deontologize. In saying that speech act, we don't perform Latin or some pre-English Germanic idiom. No, it is English, and yet it is undeniably informed and constructed by these incredibly massive, historical, de-individuated systems, which are languages. So we can make no impact as individuals on a language, virtually none. But we are obliged to go with this historical knowledge which has been embedded. And when I talk, and I use this as a kind of a model, because I noticed it there, to describe how art, if it did deontologize, if art escaped, no, we're going to get to the notion of escape, if art were able to escape performative capture, escape ontological capture, how then would it continue to have any role at all in the life of a community? Wouldn't we just lose it? It would be some sort of dead technology that would be gone and would have no further use value. But in fact, and this I will get to later, and then I'll just make this last remark before I do a sort of a revisitation of the history of the conceptual edifices of modernity and what was contemporary art. I would say that any speech act, and I draw this from a well-known distinction made by Noam Chomsky, any speech act can be understood in terms of a binary, in terms of competence and performance. A speech act need not be performed in order to be informed by linguistic competence. Competence, according to Chomsky, is that inherent skill, if you like, since the word was used, which any native speaker possesses with respect to being able to identify a speech act as being grammatically comprehensible or not. But you need never perform it, need never on any specific occasion perform a competence in order for it to exist. And if we think of art in similar terms, which are certainly not the terms of the edifices of artistic modernity, they appear indeed extremely traditionalist, pre-modern in that respect, but in fact are more related in the construction which I'm proposing from a historical migration, a kind of cross-pollination, if you like, between the field of linguistics and the field of art, whereby those, what we think of as being art, as something which must be performed by a certain frame, whereby art could exist in an entirely different form, perhaps a far more corrosive form, perhaps a form which is more consequence-laden, which has greater use value, and could come to enjoy a more fruitful relationship with other walks of human endeavor with which it collaborates. I'll come back to that for sure. So, it was in order to deal with the legacy of Marcel Duchamp, I think, that our conceptual institutions, the architecture of those edifices. Edifice is a nice word, and I was very attentive to that discussion earlier today, just previously. And in parentheses, I think that it was also a question in every talk about the crisis of today. And implicitly, although it wasn't mentioned, it wasn't named as such, one of the most flagrant places of crisis is in a lexical crisis, is in a crisis of conceptual vocabulary. The fact that we inadvertently police ourselves conceptually by continuing to perpetuate a conceptual vocabulary inherited from another century, and continue in that sense to cause violence to the intuitions which are attempting to emerge. I'm sure that anyone who deals with young artists and with students is aware of this baneful paradox, that it's necessary, of course, to transmit a conceptual vocabulary, but it's one which is obsolete. And so I consider that it to be one of the tasks, perhaps the outstanding task of the practice of theory to attempt to bring conceptual vocabularies more into line with the types of practices in their tremendous heterogeneity that are emerging. But it was to deal with, I repeat, the conceptual legacy of Marcel Duchamp, of his nieces and nephews. If we suppose that art history is not patrilinear, but somehow avunculinear, moving from aunt or uncle to nephew or niece, that the artists of contemporary art were, in that respect, the nieces and nephews of Marcel Duchamp, and the institutions which were built to perform their propositions were put in place precisely to deal with that. Because, of course, Duchamp, I scarcely need to underscore this point, made evident, self-evident, that anything could be art, absolutely anything, provided that it was framed as such. The converse of that, of course, is that nothing can take place in the art frame that isn't art. It is impossible, and Duchamp was well aware of this in raising a question, is it possible to imagine a work which is not a work of art once it has been framed performatively as such? Once that individual who is vested with a social power, that expert of expression we refer to generally as the artist, performs the work as this is art, then literally it undergoes a kind of ontological sea change, a kind of magic in an absolutely rationalized society, otherwise absolutely rationalized society. And it changes its ontology. It becomes art. It ceases to be the mere real thing, as analytical philosophers like Arthur Danto like to say, the mere real thing, and becomes an artistic proposition. But the price to pay for that, and it appears that that price is increasingly steep because it appears that there are more and more art-related practitioners who are unwilling to pay for it, is that then, by extension, it is just art. This morning, someone mentioned that art historical discourse is punctuated by adverbs. Very true. And the adverb in that sentence, which I just said, is extremely telling. Just art. It's art, but it's merely art. Modernity could have never thought such a thing. It would never run from its ontology. But yet, as I said, increasingly people are. There appears to be, and sometimes I become very empathetic when I say this and it appears prescriptive, but in fact it's really entirely descriptive at its origin, is that there appears to be more and more practitioners who are seeking ways to trouble Duchamp's possibility. And this is a kind of mea culpa, because when I initially tried to theorize these types of practices, I did so without recognizing, I think, to what extent that I was in the thrall of institutional theory. By institutional theory, I mean that body of writings and conceptual policing that we identify with such names as Arthur Danto, George Dickey, Goodman, and so on. In other words, this body of reflection which deals with it is art if the frame of art is in place and says that it is. Of course, you can sociologize this and saying, of course, that not anyone can transform the ontological status of an object. Objects are particularly resistant to this type of shifting. Urinals don't like to become, they just like to remain urinals if you don't do anything in particular. But they will shift their ontological status under these specific circumstances. So either from a sociological perspective or from a speculative philosophical one, there is a tremendous conceptual policing in place. I wanted to name those kinds of practices, of which we see more and more, which instead of remaining tweaked or jerry-rigged or ramped up deeds and contrivances in art spaces. They wanted to venture out into the real, beyond the frame, beyond the performative frame, and actually be what they could be. Gordon Matta Clark started a restaurant. He's not the only one. Daniel Spurry had already started one. Bernard Brunel started a house painting operation as a conceptual art project. Full-fledged, continues to do it 30 years later. A number of practitioners, more and more, I think, began to conceive of practices, activities, enterprises, businesses, both as what they are, libraries, you name it, streets, the list goes on, and it's ever growing. Not only as what they are, but as propositions of what they are, both the thing and the proposition of the thing. That is, both the thing and the artistic proposition. In other words, they were destabilizing that artistic ontology because some people were actually living off their house painting businesses or their restaurants and not merely seeing them as gadgets to later be reterritorialized or repatriated into the confines of the art world, into the museum. Fulfilling, of course, the museum's historical destiny in that sense because they were built to house colonial artifacts, and these artifacts are ones which could be gleaned in arts, rubbing shoulders up against the real, and then through performative documentation are brought back in and transformed into art. No, they were trying to stay outside and be what Freud called forte da, both what they are and propositions of what they are. But true to the conceptual policing, I think, or to the conceptual apparatus of institutional theory, I decided that perhaps these practices were best described as having a double ontology. A double ontology. In fact, they are what they are, and they are art, propositions of what they are. I was kind of proud of that characterization for a while because it seemed to work. I couldn't actually find any cases that refuted it. And so I tended to spout it off a little bit with my students, trying to convince them that this was the way to do it. And you know what? I systematically encountered something which I found frustratingly epistemologically naive, is that they kept saying, yeah, but I don't care if it's art. But I don't, and in different languages and in different countries, in different contexts, I'd be going on about my double ontologies and with these, I thought, really cool examples. And everybody was interested, but in the end they said, yeah, but who cares if it's art? You know? And I decided that, well, my initial response, of course, in every case was, yes, but if you don't care that it's art, then it isn't. And then we lose it. It escapes. It escapes what? It escapes ontological capture. We lose it to posterity because it will just be the mere real thing. Until, of course, I realized that it wasn't possible that the entire generation of students that I was talking to was wrong, and somehow, miraculously, I was right. Right by name and right by nature. I said, there's got to be something there. There's got to be some intuition that is absolutely being folded in to a kind of conceptual prison house devised by Arthur Danto and then, you know, chromed up and ramped up at the back by people like, theorists like me. So I decided to take that I don't care if it's art thing absolutely seriously and push it to its conclusion and to determine what exactly that might mean if that assertion was being made not only sincerely, but also informedly. If it actually really was naming a condition, an art historical condition today. And it's at that point that I began to consider the importance of exit strategies. I didn't actually choose that title, but I like it. It was suggested to me. I wouldn't have chosen it because I'm actually not going to have the time to give typologies of exit strategies, although that is an important task and one which is being undertaken in many strains of escapological research today. By escapological research, and now I've come to the middle part of my talk, I refer to that nascent extradisciplinary form of inquiry and of practice which considers ways of avoiding, eluding, or escaping different types of capture, which we see at work, particularly in the art world, and this is where I will focus, but in other life worlds as well. Attempts by a broad cross-section of practitioners of all kinds to avoid, I suppose, initially ideological capture, the ideological capture of what we call neoliberalism, that we don't want to be the inadvertent foot soldiers of an ideology, of a form of accumulation, which we find more than just uncongenial. In the art world, and it came up today many times, is that the other, beyond, of course, and perhaps absolutely indissociable from escaping ideological capture, is the desire to escape institutional capture. It's the desire to escape institutional capture, which I think emerged in the face of the frustration and even the logical scandal of not institutional theory in this case, but its practical application, which is institutional critique. The logical scandal that is so often put forward by people like Andre Fraser, that there is no outside to escape to. That the ontology of art has, paradoxically, in the historical present, saturated all its possibilities, so that there is nowhere else to go, because we can't go outside of ourselves. It's a very sophisticated in the truest sense, very sophisticated, very well articulated, and absolutely depressing lack of horizon. As she puts it, there is, within the art field, only subfields. So that you can never escape. You can escape, certainly, from some aspect, some spot within the field, but only to another subfield. And of course, this raises the question, can subfielders speak? Certainly they can't. Certainly they can't speak back to that kind of conceptual enclosure. And that kind of thing, I think, leads us to remaining, and I think this also speaks to the contemporary existential condition in the art world, leaves us in a stable form of mild depression, of constantly being confronted with art's perhaps overblown claims, but in any case, its very strong pretensions to be able to change the world, to have some perception-busting power, and then have that merely folded in and subsumed by the fact that it's merely art. This, fortunately, I think, is not the case. I think to believe that is to be held in thrall of a paradigm which has very specific historical underpinnings. It's a form of edification that we need to break. And many practitioners who have deliberately impaired their coefficient of visibility have sought to escape the radar screens of the dominant art world in order to create other art-sustaining environments elsewhere. But the question is also whether it is appropriate to leave the dominant art world with its resources, or the resources which remain, to those who are managing it in this way. Perhaps it is, and certainly I have all the empathy in the world for those who find exit strategies, get off the radar screen, and imagine injecting artistic competence into human activities to inform activism or science or any number of other things without seeking validation in the reputational economy of the mainstream art world, that seek to avoid the spotlights of the attention economy to operate more effectively in the shadows. What Greg Cholette also refers to as, art historian Greg Cholette refers to as dark matter. Art which is active like yeast, but unbeknownst to the radar screens of our curatorial police. But the question is, that I'd like to address immediately, is what are the parameters around which the radar screens of the curatorial establishment have been calibrated? What are they looking for, and what are they not looking for? What simply doesn't show up under the auspices of art? Subspecie artis, as it were. Well, I think that there are primarily three. The architecture or the edifice of modernity was premised on a kind of holy trinity of objecthood, authorship, and spectatorship. And I'd like to unpack those really quickly, although they perhaps deserve more attention ultimately, but quickly because I'd like then to turn to the man who I think is never properly acknowledged as the real architect of the conceptual edifices of what was contemporary art, and that is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, German guy who died like long time ago. Let me just talk quickly about that Holy Trinity, a couple of sentences about each of those points, which will lead to Kant. Perhaps the first one is that of authorship. Although, of course, we know that the conceptual edifices have been renovated and have been retooled to some extent in order to accommodate artistic experimentation around authorship, towards co-authorship, towards what Michel Foucault called the author function, to questions of context and so on. Nevertheless, the single signature of the artist remains absolutely linked to practices within the mainstream art world. And if it cannot be acknowledged immediately, it must be brought into play in a secondary time in order to stabilize those propositions. Authorship remains something, despite the death of the author and all the post-structural experiments around that in the 60s and 70s, remains a major tenet of the conceptual edifice. As does objecthood, and by objecthood, of course, I refer not merely to objects, the commodifiable object, but even increasingly now, the object has almost become a minority practice within art, but to the fetishization and the commodification, the reification of experience, of action, and so on. Perhaps spectatorship, the third of the three, remains still a significant challenge to the mainstream art world. It remains a stumbling block because, of course, when something is brought into that performative frame, it is brought in as art. But when it escapes that frame, it disappears as art, although it may continue to exist with the self-understanding as such. When you see something, and here an adverb comes in once again, when you see something just out in the street, it may attract your interest. It may be informed by artistic self-understanding. But unless the frame, some kind of frame, is in place, you're unlikely to constitute yourself as a spectator and to see it under the auspices of art. Of course, spectatorship does not exhaust the number of ways with which we can engage with art. And in recent years, I think the museums have attempted to square that circle with the complicity of the art critical establishment and have attempted to introduce other terms such as participation and so on as ways of engagement, as naming other regimes of engagement with things which are obviously art. But there's one thing, and here I phase to I was going to say Marcel Duchamp. It's an interesting lapsus. I should say Immanuel Kant. But Duchamp was extremely Kantian, and that's why they are the two, if you like, heroic figures of this sketch, which I'm making. One regime, I think, which is emerging massively in society now, regime of engagement with art, but one which is absolutely refused by any museum which I know of, is the regime and also the political category of subjectivity known as usership. Usership, and I'm not going to get into usership today, but it has been one of an object of a great deal of curiosity of mine in recent years, because it has emerged as a very powerful category of political subjectivity, and also as a nexus for surplus value production and extraction. I mean expropriation. There's been a shift, I think, away from the sight of the creative sector, artists and so on, of surplus value extraction towards usership. Usership actually has become a site of potential conflict, and an exciting site in that respect, and also of engagement with art, because it opposes, not only does it oppose ownership very directly as a conceptual category, not only does it oppose expert culture as a conceptual category, and expert culture is nowhere more powerfully exerted than in the art world, but it runs up headlong into the conceptual edifice of spectatorship. And that leads me to Kant. Because if the art world were able to accommodate a regime of engagement like usership, they would have to renounce the Kantian edification, the foundation, the very foundation upon which they are premised. And I would like to quote just two very paradoxical and yet extremely consequence-laden conceptual categories that are key, they are the key to these conceptual edifices, which are museums and galleries, shored up, of course, by the critical apparati that surround them and curatorship and so on and so on. And the first one is well known. They're both put forward in what's known as the third critique, which is the critique of judgment, a book which Kant wrote at the end of toward the end of the 18th century. The first one is how Immanuel Kant came to characterize art as being different than any other form of human activity, any other kind of symbolic configuration. And he described it as having a very important salient characteristic, being characterized by its purposeless purpose. Purposeless purpose. It's a very beautiful idea, and I think one which can be very seductive in a world like ours, which is increasingly hell-bent on cost-benefit analysis and other forms of utilitarianism. Very seductive because Kant didn't say that art is useless. Didn't say it didn't have any purpose. It has a purpose, as he specifically announces in those two words. That its Zweck, as he puts it, is to be zwecklos. Its purpose is to be purposeless. Precluding, of course, any notion of use value. Not avoiding a kind of circularity in that way, because, of course, something that is that useless, of course, is a bit useful anyway. But nevertheless, embedding this very idea in the way art should be, could be, would be captured ontologically. And the other one, which goes hand in hand with his notion of purposeless purpose, is equally paradoxical, equally amusing if you look at it with a little bit of distance, is that of disinterested spectatorship. Disinterested spectatorship. Of course, you could say that this is a rather intellectualist vision of art, but ultimately, this is not exactly what Kant meant by the notion of disinterest. By disinterested spectatorship, Kant wanted to square himself kind of a circle so that he could at once preserve the subjectivity of the beholder and preserve at the same time the cognitive dimension of artistic propositions. And in order to do that, he needed something like, to go along with purposeless purpose, disinterested spectatorship. There will be a lot, of course, to say about these two conceptual edifices, which I think continue to not burrow their way forward, but to actually constitute the foundations of our ongoing edifices. So that when we talk about what was, or we talk about going beyond what was contemporary art, we are inevitably talking about going beyond those types of conceptual edifices, precisely those. We're talking about, when we talk about sundering art from itself, we're talking about sundering it not from the idea that there's some end of art, or there will be no more art, but sundering it from those characteristics which gave it its very being, the ontology to which it was assigned. Which makes it actually so difficult sometimes for us even to see art as being something possible, as having conditions of possibility, to use Kant's term, having conditions of possibility outside of objecthood, spectatorship, authorship, beyond purposeless purpose, which is in essence, if you like, it's Kant's way of describing autonomous art. Autonomy comes at that price. Beyond disinterested spectatorship, to these types of propositions, and now I come back to those ones, the ones that I was telling my students about, the ones that we're seeing more and more of, even the ones which, and I don't have any reason to suppose that they were chosen for this reason, but the majority of the artistic propositions which are in the exhibition, How Much Fascism? Many of which actually are what I would describe as full-scale practices, one-to-one practices, on a one-to-one scale, no longer on the reduced scale, which is required by this trinity and this conceptual edification of modern art. So let's I'd like to share with you just two texts before I conclude around a proposal which I, paradoxically as it may seem, actually take from Marcel Duchamp about a way to think this de-ontologization of art which we see going on around us. It doesn't matter which order we do these two in. This is a page from a book written in 1893 by Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll, of course, who was well-known, very eccentric British author, known for his adventures of Alice, actually also deserves to be well-known for this book here, which is called Sylvie and Bruno Concluded. He wrote an initial book called Sylvie and Bruno, and then this one in 1893, Sylvie and Bruno Concluded. And in this very strange book, we learn of the adventures of this sort of outlandish or even extraterrestrial character with the very Germanic name Mein Herr. And in this particular case, Mein Herr meets the narrator, who's a young British man, and his girlfriend. And they engage an impromptu discussion. I'll just quote, because it might not be easy to read from the distance. "That's another thing we've learned from your nation," said Mein Herr, "map making. But we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful?" With more time, it would be interesting to do an imminent reading of this text, to analyze word by word. But I bring it up because I think one of the more interesting, I talked about a shift away from a representational paradigm. I'm not saying that artists today do not have recourse to representation. Of course they do, and inevitably always will. But breaking with a representational paradigm is another proposition altogether. And I think one of the last, and often very elegant, very seductive, even apparently quite contagious forms of representation is that of cognitive mapping, which is kind of perhaps in the wane now, but which was sort of overtook the art world's attention economy about several years ago. And so this reflection here on mapping is for me very interesting because it kind of marks a shift from mapping towards something perhaps different without sacrificing anything. So the last word there is quite interesting. Would you consider the largest map that would be really useful? Because maps have to be useful. Not like art. "About 6 inches to the mile." "Only 6 inches?" exclaimed Mein Herr. "We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile, and then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile." Probably, or there's at least a better chance that you're familiar with the writings of the great Argentinian thinker and writer Borges, in which he talks about a map which is made on this scale. But in fact, Borges merely took up this idea here from Lewis Carroll. The next part is even more interesting and even more paradoxical. "Have you used it much?" I inquired. "It has never been spread out yet," said Mein Herr. "The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So now we use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you, it does nearly as well." It's extremely interesting. It's extremely interesting because on the one hand, it provides a critique, a very unexpected critique actually from the angle of political ecology, of the representational paradigm. And at the same time, it seems to offer a way out. It seems to offer an escape route. Because I suppose that mapping fancies itself as being, as drawing attention to that which is neglected. that respect, you might say that cartographers and artists are rather similar, is that they have something of a mission to draw attention to those who have been so unjustly deprived of it. Not taking into consideration, of course, that perhaps there may be compelling reasons to withdraw to the shadows, to not want to be on the map, to not want to participate in a kind of panopticon 2.0 version, to mapping our own places on a map for the cartographical police. If we must be mapped, let them do it. But the interesting thing here is that it suggests, the farmer's complaint, I mean, suggests that any representation, because it will be a light diffracting or light blocking device, will also cast shadows. So although we could link the white dream of cartography to a realization of the Enlightenment project, we need to bear in mind, as it's pointed out here, as the farmers point out, that it will also cast a shadow. And this leads to the final Mein Herr's resolution of the problem, is that they use the land itself as its own map, and it does nearly as well. Just parenthetically add that the next question is also extremely interesting, but we won't talk about it here. Now let me ask you another question. What is the smallest world you would care to inhabit? And then they go on to discuss the paradoxes and potential of world making. Definitely worth checking it out. But the question that I have, and I think it's a question, if my observations are accurate at all, is that one of the questions which is perhaps not being articulated, but is somehow working the collective unconscious of many practitioners, is how can we get to that scale outside of representation? How can we use the land itself, as it were, the mere real thing, as its own map? How can we both orient ourselves in something which actually is not other than itself? This is obviously a very clear ontological question, but it also articulates in its very idiosyncratic and singular way a kind of exit strategy, a kind of escapological drive or pulsion away from representation, with the idea of doing something at a one-to-one scale with the thing itself. There could be many instances of this, many examples of this sort of thing. And it's a way that I try to describe these types of practices without having recourse to the dominant artistic ontology, without talking about a double ontology. Perhaps you saw the work in the show, How Much Fascism, of Burak Delier. These parkas that a company which he created, designed and marketed, which have a particularity that they are, if you saw the show you know this, designed to protect you in violent demonstrations and confrontations with the police. So if I had taken this example with my students a while ago, I would have said, well, you see, they have a double ontology because they both are what they are, and of course a very symbolic, crafty, clever way of keeping one foot in the art world and one foot out in the public domain and the fight for a different society. They are what they are and a proposition of what they are. I may, of course, be misreading that work, but the fact is that even if it is only an artistic proposition, even if there was no fundamental attempt to make money by or go the whole 9 yards in distributing these parkas in the broader society, there is, and if those marketing surveys were merely ways through a kind of over-identification of drawing attention to marketing strategies of all and sundry in contemporary market logic, one can't deny as an art critic that there is some kind of an instability which has been built in to this type of proposition, and one which we see right across the board. Next to that, the work of Avi Mograbi, for example, which I would also say is, of course, has recourse to representation because we have access to it through a representation, through a film. But in the one-to-one confrontation between the activist or the camera, the man behind the camera, and the Israeli soldiers, the type of engagement which is shown is one which is not entirely unlike this idea of using the land itself as his own map. I could go on, but I'm sure that you yourselves have seen these types of propositions, and so I want to conclude by looking at a second example. This is difficult to read, but I will read an excerpt from it. It's a letter written by the American theorist Lucy Lippard to then Yugoslav, or Belgrade-based, let's say, conceptualist Goran Đorđević. Now, I bring up this example because I think one of the more interesting sites of conflict, not only within art, but in other life worlds as well. Because these exit strategies, which I talk about as being in art, is because we're addressing the question beyond what was contemporary art continued. It would be interesting and important to have this discussion also around what contemporary universities were continued. When we see increasing numbers of those who have been trained in academia withdrawing their epistemic or epistemological labor and injecting it into other forms of social life, and doing it, for all intents and purposes, a much better job. And I think that's undeniably something which we are going to see more and more of, and that's one of the reasons which I entirely support Rasha Salti's optimism in general, is that the privatization of universities is really a way of them cutting off their noses to spite their faces, because as it becomes impossible to attend these institutions, as debt loads become absurd and nobody cares to take them on anymore, there will be obviously exit strategies which are viable, which will be envisaged, and we see them being experimented with today. But one of the sites of conflict, and thus of a nexus of investigation, and one of the major assumptions which is very rarely contested within art, is that of the ideology of productivism. Productivism is nowhere less contested in the art world than in the art world. And the art world is all the less equipped to contest it, as it is one of the places that has been most instrumental in test driving it and applying it. Typically, when you critique productivism in art world circles, I don't know, I hope I'm talking about the mainstream art world in this case, and I hope that it's changing, and talk about strategies for degrowth. One is met with the amusing response that, yeah, that is a really cool idea. We actually should do a book on that, and maybe a few more artworks and a couple of exhibitions. That's a great idea. Yeah, let's produce some art around that. As if, but it's amusing, but at the same time, it has the same root cause, that permanent state of ontological exception, which art continues to enjoy. That it doesn't, that whatever rules it may detect in other walks of human endeavor, of course, do not apply to it. Goran Đorđević in the late 1970s wrote a letter to a number of European and North American conceptualists, those primarily associated with radical left politics, and asked them if they would join him in what he referred to as an international art strike. He took up the idea initiated several years before by Gustav Metzer, and which would later would have a third episode at least. And today there is, given the current situation, there's a certain amount of debate and discussion ongoing about the viability or the interest or the possibility, potential of creative strike. I'll come back to that in a second. And so he wrote to these artists, asking them if they would join him in the withdrawal of artistic labor. He wrote to such people as Lawrence Wiener and Vito Acconci, Hans Haacke, Sol LeWitt, and so on and so on. The responses were cordial, but in every case, it was a polite no. Wiener said, for example, no, that it would be merely cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. He actually wrote that in caps on the typewriter, so I guess it was a statement. Hans Haacke said that nobody would notice, and anyways, the only artists that would participate in this are the ones that should most be pushed to the forefront of the attention economy anyways to change the world and so on. An unflinching belief in the power of art to have political traction within the dominant attention economy of that time. But the most interesting response, or the most detailed at any rate, is from art theorist Lucy Lippard, who had done so much for that generation of conceptualists to theorize what they were up to. And this is the one that I want to share with you. It's a poor copy because I took it on my phone when this project was shown or documented in the Nova Gallery in Zagreb several years ago. Well, Lucy Lippard says no also. She's not interested. The first thing she does, she says, no, I don't want to participate in this because, and then she does what art worlders typically do. She goes on to talk about what she's doing. So she mentions 3 very interesting projects that she's doing. This in a response to a very specific question. Okay, so she makes it clear that her productivist stance is not to be doubted. And then she says, paragraph 2, it's interesting to read, but we won't do that right now. As you can see, she says, I place my faith in action, organization, networking. I stop on that verb, networking, because although it's become absolutely mainstream and almost invisible in that sense to us, at this time it was unusual in art critical discourse to speak of that. So in a sense, we are in a kind of in a moment of shift here as well. My faith I think is exactly the word, my faith in action, organization, networking, and this is the part that I really like, rather than in making voids which I fear would be invisible. Making voids, which I fear would be invisible. The fear of the invisible void. The fear of the invisible void, I think, in a certain sense, characterizes perfectly the productivist bias, but at the same time reveals the limited potential of that kind of faith, as she puts it. Because, of course, the opposite of the fear of invisible voids, right, is the faith, I guess, invisible plenitudes, which is a strange thing for the theorist of conceptual art to put forward. But nevertheless, it appears to me, it names one of the unspoken assumptions of, in this case, the contemporary art edifice, its fear of the invisible void. And even the refusal even to attempt, even for a short time, the withdrawal of artistic or of creative labor, or even to entertain the idea as something worth, an avenue worth exploring. It deserved a one-page letter, but not more than that. At the same time, I'm heartily in favor of communication between artists in all countries who are rebelling against the repression, economic and political, and institutionalization of the idea of art, since the sterilization process that is underway must be stopped by some relatively drastic means. I hope that you will not let Middle European artists, I hope that you will let Middle European artists know about PAD, which is the publication, the Political Art Documentation Project, which he was initiating at that time, and that we could get into an exchange to articulate groups all over the world. The actions that could arise from such coordinated efforts will be, I think, far more effective than withdrawing from a system that would have no trouble attracting scabs to replace us. Okay, so I think in that, I read those last two sentences not because they are of any particular interest. In fact, they show that she has a firm grasp on the obvious. But for precisely that reason, that that's just exactly the kind of discourse which the art police within us oblige us to, through a form of mimicry, as if something were speaking through Lucy Depard. Absolutely nothing new there. And we've been saying it ever since. And it's for that we live in this state of, now rather stable, within the privileged setting of the art world, of course, of mild depression. But let's get out of that, because, and I'll end on these speculative remarks, which I draw once again from Marcel Duchamp, as if Duchamp somehow had a hand in creating a situation which holds us captive, but at the same time, perhaps gave us some kind of conceptual tools that would allow us to undo that and to escape ontological capture. And that little sense of hope comes from a late lecture given by Duchamp, who didn't give many. He gave several, which were very pithy and constant sources of reinterpretation. It was one called The Creative Act, a lecture which he gave in the late 1950s, in which he put forward a concept which strangely has never been really thoroughly unpacked. I think actually some of Duchamp's greatest ideas, like the reciprocal ready-made, have not attracted the attention that, well, at least I think that they deserve. In this particular case, Duchamp puts forward this idea that he refers to as the coefficient of art. Coefficient of art, he says, is the way he wants to name, with a kind of arithmetic relationship. He wants to name the space, or the gap, the interstice, between that which was projected but not realized, and that which was unintentionally expressed. Something which exists, of course, in every artistic proposition, and it's precisely that space, I think, in which, well, the act of judgment, if we believe in that, is exercised, in which the practice of theory can take place. It's that space which explains that an artistic proposition is never exhausted in its moment of initial reception, but can actually shift and change or not through public time. But I think that there's something of a coefficient of art in the proposition of a coefficient of art. I mean that there is something unthought, unexplicit, unintentional, but nevertheless present in this notion of a coefficient of art put forward by Duchamp. Because to talk about a coefficient of art is to suggest that art is not a stable category. It's rather like asking the question, the paradoxical question, how much fascism? Like we think we know fascism, so we don't say how much, we say we don't want it, yes, no. And the question of the coefficient of art implicitly raises an idea of how much art, which is not a way that we are accustomed or have become accustomed, habituated to, thinking about art. That perhaps, though, Duchamp is suggesting that perhaps not in all things, but in many things, many human contrivances, deeds, actions, activities, and passivities, there is a certain coefficient of art. And in some cases, of course, that coefficient of art might be very significant, very strong. And in other cases, the coefficient would be comparatively weak. But it certainly would be a way of understanding what is meant by, I don't care if it's art or not. The idea that activities which are not performed as art, therefore they don't have to care if they're art or not, could be nevertheless informed by some kind of artistic competence, by some coefficient of art, although they may or may never be performed. In other words, they may or may never be subject to performative capture or to ontological capture. That makes of us, in a sense, not the nephews and nieces of Marcel Duchamp, but his orphans. And in a way, that's a much more felicitous situation in which to find us in this moment of art's historical migration. It's migration away from ontological capture, or at least from systemic ontological, performative, institutional, and ideological capture. The idea that there could be coefficients of art in these activities where art could finally recover that use value which had been invisibly bracketed off by these conceptual edifices of modernity, and can gain or regain that use value and corrosivity, that consequence-laden power or puissance, potential, that from which it had been deprived in what was contemporary art. Thank you.